Before I introduce our three conversationalists, I wanted to say that this conversation has been put together in honour of the late artist Gordon Bennett. So our three speakers are Richard Bell, one of Australia's most significant artists, and you might have to correct my pronunciation, Richard. He's of Kamilaroi, Kumar, Jimin and Garangarang descent and lives and works in Brisbane. Richard works across a variety of media, painting, installation, performance and video. He was one of the artists in Sakahan, the International Indigenous Art exhibition at the National Gallery of Canada that Ruth spoke about this morning. And he also featured in the 5th Moscow Biennale of Contemporary Art last year, and this year had a solo exhibition of his work, Embassy, at the Perth Institute of Contemporary Art in Perth. Josh Milani, next to him, is the director of Milani Gallery in Brisbane. He's been an art dealer since 2003 and represents artists including Vernon Arquis, Gordon Bennett, Richard Bell, Judy Watson, and has been active in positioning contemporary Australian art in an international dialogue. Ian McLean, our third person, is a senior research professor of contemporary art at the University of Wellington. He's published extensively on Australian art and particularly Aboriginal art within a contemporary context. Their discussion today is about appropriation, modernism and Indigenous art in the contemporary field. Thank you very much.
Okay, so what we're going to do is I'll just quickly introduce what we're going to talk about and ask these two guys a question, and then I think we'll just let the conversation flow from there. And then after about 45 minutes, we're going to open up for questions. 40 minutes. Okay. Oh, is that right? We have to end in 45 minutes. 40 minutes, you'll tell me when. Okay. Anyway, as you've probably gathered, in this our third meeting, our aim was or is to discuss the relations, I suppose, between Indigenous modernism and contemporary art, as if they can be put in relation. And Gordon Bennett, you know, as Gordon Bennett said, you can't have a future without a past. And he, more than any other late 20th century artist I can think of, interrogated the connections between modernism and contemporary art. It was sort of almost the raison d'etre of his art. And central to this interrogation was the methodology of appropriation. And as you can see here, for example, his appropriation of the Australian modernist Margaret Preston at the last documenta. And that's why Peter initially asked me to interview Gordon for this conference. And that's the reason why we chose appropriation as the theme. It's sort of less relevant. We'll probably talk less about it, but I'll just say a little bit about it in relationship to Gordon. Gordon was, as you know, an appropriation artist, and appropriation is generally associated with a postmodernist critique of modernism and its cult of originality and the artist ego. Yet we shouldn't forget that modernists like Preston often appropriated art as well, and often Indigenous art. And Gordon's great lesson, I think, to artists in the 90s was that appropriation is like a double-edged sword. The appropriated can easily reappropriate the appropriators. Now, Gordon believed that to speak without appropriation is not to know who is speaking through you, which is why he always contextualised his work within appropriation. He said, otherwise you're ignorant of the discourse that you're voicing. As if he thought that he could only really know himself through the voices of others. Thus, appropriation, especially in Gordon's work, is not to be confused with plagiarism, which silences rather than acknowledges other voices. And Gordon saw his art as a sort of field of reverberations of other voices. And this concept of reverberation was very important to him. And I'll just sort of end on one more little final comment about appropriation I think is important to Gordon. Heidegger said that appropriation really only occurs at certain fateful moments, what he called emergencies when the future and past collide, as if the appropriator is actually being appropriated by history or by these momentous, I was going to say momentous moments, but it sounds a bit redundant. Anyway, Gordon was very drawn to these moments of colliding realities, and so too is Richard. Over lunch, Richard was telling me, or Josh was telling me about an exhibition, just to give you an example, that Josh put on where the theme was white paintings, or white paintings?
Yeah, white paintings.
He invited several artists who all brought in their white paintings, but Richard's painting, of course, was a black painting. And as if he was, deliberately trying to create this moment of colliding realities. Another good example, which I alluded to in my lecture, was when Gordon intervened in a heated debate that flared in Australia around Iman Stiller's appropriation of Michael Nelson Jagamara. And Richard happened to be working in the same studio when Imants and Michael began their first collaborations. And when he was, as we'll see in a minute, Richard didn't hesitate to appropriate the lot of them, leading to his well-known Bell's theorem. Now, Josh, so that's the sort of reason why we invited Richard along. We thought he would be able to, in a way, step in the shoes of Gordon very ably. The reason we invited Josh is that he is both Gordon's and Richard's dealer. He was also Imance's dealer at one stage as well. But the main reason we invited him is that to my mind, he's very good at sort of appropriating his own stable of artists and putting them into a sort of post-conceptual trajectory and creating conversations in the way he presents his art that challenge the conventional paradigmatic divisions between modern and contemporary, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, national and international. And that's sort of some of the issues that I'm hoping Josh will talk about. So what we're going to do is roll some images behind you that have some images of Gordon and Richard and some other images, and we'll also stop them at certain stages to show you some of Richard's videos, just as background while we're talking. So can we start rolling those images? And I'll just sort of start with a very simple question to Richard, which is if he could sort of just comment on the impact that Gordon's work had on him in his own initiating his own practice, but also where you think you've taken that initial impact and sort of made it very much your own, which you have because it can be often.
Yeah, I met him in the late 80s. I think he was still a student at QCA, and I came to art from tourist art. I was painting boomerangs and spears and that sort of stuff. Yeah. I was telling a story about how I actually got into fine art. I was having this conversation with this white fellow, unnamed, of course, and he suggested that I get into fine art. I said, "What are you talking about? Look at these fine lines here." He laughed, of course, and then he said, "No, I mean high art." I said, "Oh, what would I do in that thing? That's for girls and gays." You know? So, I'm a recovering homophobe, so. And I said, "No, I don't want to do that." He said, "Well, you can get away with things." I was still into activism back then, and he said, "You can get away with stuff there. You can say virtually whatever you want, and you won't get arrested." And I was mildly interested with that. And he said, "Why don't you get into that?" I said, "Oh, look, if I did that, I'd tell these white fuckers exactly what I think of them." Yeah? And he said, "Well, just do it." And then I look at him and say, sit down here. You know, so we had about a 5 or 6 year discussion about art. And that, along the way, I made some art, trying to do stuff. And during one of the artists that I was introduced in that time, in those early days, was Gordon Bennett, and introduced to his work, which I thought was fantastic. You know, I think Daddy's Little Girl sticks in my mind. You know, today. You know. And what that showed me was that you could use text in this art. You know, like, so I could say basically whatever I wanted, you know, and not get arrested, you know, and make money. You know, so it seemed like a good deal to me. You know, so that's pretty much how I got into it. The importance of Gordon Bennett, though, for us operating now, is that he dealt with so many of the issues with respect to modernism and the postmodern. All the academic side of stuff, you know, we don't have to deal with that these days. It's already been, you know, more than adequately dealt with by Gordon Bennett. So that's the legacy that he's left us.
And in terms of where your work went after that, you know, it sort of your work sort of shifted fairly radically, really, I suppose, in the 21st century, didn't you? Became much more performative.
Yeah. Well, I slowed down my art making almost to a stop for about 7 years, you know, to help raise my young children, and then recovering from, you know, life on the streets, you know, like when my relationship broke up. So I made a comeback into art in the early noughties, like 2001 or something. That same unnamed white fellow come and picked me up in Redford, and I was asleep on the ground at 11 o'clock in the morning, and he came over to get me cleaned up to go to a Lynn Onus retrospective at the MCA. That was pretty instrumental in getting me off the streets and back making art again. So
it strikes me that Gordon was a fairly private person.
He was a very private
whereas
person.
You're a very public, in your face sort of person.
No, I'm not. I'm really nice. You know, all my friends tell me how nice I am. You know. Well, I work within a very narrow band, you know, of expertise. And being a painter, you know, like with everybody saying painting's dead, and you know, like, it's very difficult to maintain your profile, you know, like in art, you know. So I've developed, you know, like strategies to make sure that, you know, if people stop talking about me, that I get them talking about me again. And part of that was performance and videos. So, like, I'm a really good show-off, and that's how I call my showing off performances. So it's good fun.
Maybe, Josh, you've got this little concrete box near the Wollongabba cricket grounds, and from there you've sort of managed to give your stable of artists, or some of them anyway, a sort of international profile. It'd be interesting to hear from you how you see, or just how you've done that, I suppose, and how that relates to how you're reading the sort of contemporary moment and the relationship of Indigenous art.
Sure.
In that contemporary moment.
Well, I guess that requires a tiny bit of back history. The gallery, which, as you say, is near the Gabba cricket ground, is it sort of takes its starting point as around about 1968, and in particular with conceptualism. An artist by the name of Ian Byrne, who was formed Art and Language with Mel Ramsden in New York and others, and Terry Smith was involved, during those years. His work is kind of where the gallery begins. So he tragically died in 1993, but his work was involved in essentially the destabilisation of hierarchies within the art world at the time, like a lot of the best conceptual artists were, I think, and functioning primarily through language. Gordon emerges in the late 80s, and so I think the next key point is probably 88, 89. In Australia in 1998, we had the 200-year centennial settlement or invasion celebrations, depending on your position. And it was around that time, 88, 89, there were all these other things happening in the globe, obviously, that there was this momentum for change, and a lot of artists seemed to get swept up in it. I was interested to note that the show that we were talking about earlier in relation to Michael Perikofi was in 1990, and that it seemed that all over the globe at that moment there was this kind of shift in thinking. And that was particularly so in Australia, and I think Gordon and then Richard were central to that shift in thinking. There was this emergence, and in America you had people like Jimmy Durham who were coming into the public discourse through art, because art, it seems to me, was a space where they could actually have some agency. The media wasn't taking up their conversation. So literature, poetry, art, these were the main forms of discourse. In Brisbane has a particularly conservative history. We had a very oppressive government. Many of you, he was originally a New Zealander actually, Joe Piocchi-Peterson. Thank you for sending him over. But in a way there was this reaction to the conservative politics, and also I think we actually had a large Indigenous community in Brisbane. So there was a reaction to what was going on, to the politics of the place. And, we had the best punk music, we had probably the best political art. There was a kind of a tension there that seemed to come out, particularly during that period in the 80s and the 90s. And I guess my position as a gallerist is that you need to be descriptive of the culture from which you emerge. You can't kind of confect something that's not describing what's happening. I mean, you can, but it would be disingenuous. And in order to engage with the local culture, this art had to be taken into consideration. And it just so happens that many of the best artists at that time were people like Gordon, Richard, and later Vernon Arkey, Judy Watson. But I've shown them alongside, and this was really started by Peter Bellis, who started with Gordon Bennett. And then when I started working with Richard and others in 2003. But was to show the work alongside conceptual art, to show it alongside feminist art, to show it alongside environmental art, so that there was no distinction or hierarchy, in a sense, between what was being discussed. This was just art that was being treated as contemporary art. And, many of the best curators, I think, today, such as Carolyn Christoph Barkachev in the last Documenta, really took that position in a way. She was showing Indigenous Australian art alongside revolutionary art from the Middle East, alongside, in some of those images up there where Gordon's work is displayed, you'll see that she also presented Gordon alongside Margaret Preston and Emily Carr. So she brought in another colonial dialogue from Canada, or post-colonial or appropriation dialogue as well. And in the centre of that, she had another artist I represent, Stuart Ringholt, who's non-Indigenous. He makes performative work, and his work was essentially an anger workshop. It was where you could go and experience, let out your trauma, and then at the end of it, it turns into this kind of love workshop where the people in the room, all of whom were strangers, were making peace with each other and themselves. So within this kind of history of appropriation between Margaret Preston, and Gordon Bennett, and then Emily Carr and the First Nations in and around Canada, was this kind of, if you came in at the right moment, there was this screaming and this racket going on where people were letting out all their anger, and then suddenly this Mozart music had come on and people would start hugging. So she set up a dialogue with a kind of very contemporary performative work and this history that seemed to me to be dealing with a whole lot of tensions that are present, you know, that are contemporary but have a history. And in a way, that's the kind of position I've taken with the gallery, that I've tried to actually, the artists should be in a conversation with each other in a way and that very much happens. That's something that I'm planning to continue because Ian Byrne, for example, was in a dialogue with Adrian Piper. And Adrian Piper, in terms of identity politics and feminist art and performance art, I think is probably one of the most significant figures of the late 20th century and is still making great work. But there's also a strong relationship between what she's trying to do with art and what Richard does. So to bring her into conversation with those artists makes a lot of sense to me. So I hope that in some way answers the question. Yep.
Do you think because you're interested in creating those sort of conversations rather than promoting just a single artist as a sort of standalone person, is that why contemporary international curators are coming to your gallery to look for artists for their thing? Because it's not as if you're going out to the world to sell your wares. It seems the world, for some reason, will come and visit your gallery. I mean, what do you think?
My bribes must be bigger.
Your bribes are bigger.
No, it's because of the artists. And as I say, I've tried to give it some form in the sense that I've got a narrative and something which connects the artists, say to the moment of conceptualism and then the flowering into a sort of the possibility of socio-political art. Yeah. I think, you know, the artists that I've then worked with have been informed by that, but they just happen to be really significant artists, and that's why the curators are coming. It's not because of any particular thing that I'm doing, because I'm not actually out there. I mean, I go when my artists are represented in these, you know, in Documenta or whatever. I always go and I make an effort to be involved. And over time, I've developed a very good relationship with Carolyn Christoph Barkachev. So now she would come or talk to me about things that are happening at the gallery. But that's an organic process. But I think it's essentially because of the artists and you know, what they're doing, how they're using art as an agency, a form of agency. You know.
Did Gordon play a significant role in that, you think, due to his...
Central, yeah, I think. I mean, we were talking earlier, Gordon in 1994 spoke at the Tate Modern. It was the Third Eye, was it?
No, it was the New Internationalism.
The New Internationalism was a conference at the Tate in 1994, and it was there that he met Jimmy Durham, and they formed a friendship which lasted, you know, their life. But I think that meeting and Liz Ann McGregor taking up Gordon's work and touring it around Northern Europe and Britain really opened up the space for the kind of art that he and Richard have been making in Australia. And now it just so happens that, you know, like at the Moscow Biennale last year, Richard showed his Aboriginal tent embassy, and at the time, I think some of you may remember, there was a lot of dialogue in the art world about whether or not gay artists who were excluded from essentially Russian culture. I mean, there were laws preventing homosexuality, and it was criminalised. Where artists had to make a decision as to whether or not they would participate in the Moscow Biennale. And Richard's tent, a lot of them decided to just participate because they felt that if they excluded themselves, then it would be a form of self-censorship and that they would be giving the Russian government what it wanted. But you couldn't really discuss that openly in any of the forums at the at the Moscow Biennale. So in the seminars like this, it was kind of something that was just left unspoken. But Richard's 10 Embassy was a site, you'll notice there are chairs in it, was a site where people could go and meet and have discussions about radicality and what art should be doing. And those conversations took place in that embassy space. So the Aboriginal Embassy suddenly became the centre of this kind of international conversation about, you know, what was happening there, how artists were being positioned, how the gay community was being positioned, and it was that's it there. I don't know if you can see the chairs. It was on a platform raised above the whole exhibition, and it showed that, you know, I think it showed something interesting, was that there was this agency that art was giving, but also that a kind of an embassy, which, you know, the poetics of that idea, I think, is very, very lovely. Mm.
Like diplomatic immunity and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And they placed it on top of everything. Damn, you know, like my ego was really stroked that day.
And Richard, you're a man of the world now, very much. Can you talk a little bit about how you see, because you're a man of the world, but you're a man of Brisbane at the same time. Brisbane's very important to you as a place where you choose to live. Can you talk a little bit about that sort of intersection between Brisbane as a sort of local place and then these, you know, your own biennales around the world now, and this sort of intersection between the local and global, I suppose, which has been running through some of the papers?
Yeah, sure. Well, Brisbane's my home. I'm not from there. That's not my country, but, you know, I've been welcomed there by the traditional owners. Judy Watson was asked at the MCA a couple of weeks ago, you know, what is it about Brisbane that's producing all this art and artists? And her thing was, there's this huge slab of granite underneath that, and that affects us spiritually and creatively in some way. And I'm not going to argue with that. I tend to think that it's probably because we're a cultural backwater, you know, like a political laughingstock of the country. You know, so and we make work under those sort of circumstances. And well, I make my best work in Brisbane, so I'm very comfortable there. I've lived in New York for nearly a year. Being there, you know, I realised, you know, that I had cultural agency. You know, like in Australia, when I took my work there, I didn't have to contextualise it at all. You know, like they knew what was going on. I didn't have to explain to them the issues and whatever. So I was making art that, you know, that was actually global without even trying to do that. You know, I didn't try to position myself, you know, in the global market or anything like that.
Maybe we should show that video.
Oh,
Yeah. Can we?
Blackfellas Guide to New York. This is the trailer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a trailer to a film that's not been made yet. Is that right? Yeah.
The Statue of Liberty was a gift to the people of the United States from the people of France to commemorate the centennial of the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
His title for the statue is actually Liberty Enlightens the World. Obviously the torch is the light.
First you've got to get liberty.
Oh, yeah, 10 nuns. In New York, a black pepper is called a moulignon, and it's also an Italian slur for black people that mafia guys use.
I'll look at your ugly faces. Are you willing to look? I'll look at your ugly faces.
It is the symbol of New York. Everybody thinks the Big Apple. Bullshit. It's the big pepper.
Right. Do you want to, Richard, talk a little bit about your videos, maybe the one you're making now?
Well, it's the story of this evil art dealer who's ruining the art world. It's called Larry. You know, any resemblance to any person living or dead is purely coincidental. We've got a little trailer for that as well.
Do you want to say a bit about it first? And then, oh, here it comes.
I've appropriated Nino Rhoda's music.
There is great excitement in the art world today with the opening of the Venice Biennale.
With those eyes.
You must tell me what you do to poor artists in Venice.
They're like putty in my hands. I can shape them into anything that I want.
But, Larry, don't the artists get there by merit? Larry?
So you want to tell us about the narrative?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's just well, there's a lot of dissatisfaction in among many artists around the world, with the way that the art world's going, with the preponderance of shiny art, and just, well, I'll be kind, work with no context. What do you want?
It's time, is it?
So, time.
It went quickly.
Sorry,
So
it went quick.
One question.
So we're going to open it up for questions. Do we have any questions?
Good, let's go.
Oh, yeah, there's someone right up there.
Testing. Thanks, guys, for your conversation. This question is for Josh Milani. I'm interested in how you position your artists in a variety of different contexts and conversations that are currently happening all over the world. So I would like to ask you, in your opinion, what are the current burning issues that you think that are facing our world today in the context of, the art world?
Thanks for the question.
It's a small question.
Gee, I wish I had a few answers, but look, I think insofar as as art can address those issues, I mean, I think artists are asking questions about, what the direction of humanity is, and I think in the context like Australia and perhaps New Zealand, where you're removed from what might be seen as the central discourse, that is, you're a peripheral culture. In a way, you have a strength, which is your outsideness or your peripherality gives you a position on things that that people from the centre perhaps don't see. But obviously, there for I think environmentalism is obviously something that is being taken up and has been for a long time. I still think feminism is a really important force within art. I think there's, and sexual politics generally. I think issues to do with, governance and corporatisation, issues to do with ethics, morality in a world where you've got obviously, it's big stuff, but I think artists are generally, it's a space of symbolism where, imagining a future is possible, and art contributes to the discussion. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but
you just referred to the centre and the periphery. Do you think that metaphor carries much weight anymore?
Well, just one comment I'd make was when I went to, it does and it doesn't. I think it's changed. Obviously, the art world's decentralised, but for example, when I went to the Berlin Biennale to support Gordon's work earlier this year, what I noticed was there were all these artists who've moved from their homelands and gone to Berlin because, it's tax effective and they encourage artists to move there. And so you have, people from Brazil, from Nigeria, from, even from New Zealand, from Australia, from all over the world. But then what's happening is, when you look at their work, it's in this kind of conversation, which I refer to as a kind of international parochialism. There's a sort of sameness about the work. Almost every artist in Berlin now seems to be doing a choreography piece. And in some way, it's what Richard was talking about before. Your muse is where you come from to a certain extent. When you were having dinner with Kentridge, they were in a show together earlier this year, William Kentridge and Richard, and Kentridge said, "Why would I leave Johannesburg? It's what makes me tick," And he said to Richard, "You don't have to live in Berlin to be an artist, Which
I believed you.
Yeah, and I think place is a muse, and what I think I've seen happen increasingly over the last 10 or more years that I've been involved is this further interest in what's happening in places like this. So in a way, the periphery has the power to a certain extent, increasingly, or has some agency. Yeah.
Terry, up there. Yeah.
Okay, hi guys. So a question about appropriation, which now is 30, 40, almost 40 years old as an art strategy, and that's the term that dominated the early part of the discussion. So my question is it enough to keep talking in that manner?
Speak closer to the microphone?
Can you just elaborate a bit more on the idea of appropriation? Because we seem to keep retreating back to that as what did happen in the 80s, particularly in Australia, and that was the term that was used a lot. But it did tend to disappear the artist, and it did tend to disappear a sort of signature or a very specific way in which artists who have now been using appropriation for 30 years have developed. And one of my concerns about it is that it somehow stops us thinking in a more specific way about the work that's actually going on, and whether something distinctive was in fact generated in Gordon's later work, which I think it was, and Ian's written about it, Richard's doing it, many artists are doing it. So what other kind of terms do you have in your vocabularies for what's been happening more recently with this kind of work?
Is that addressed to anyone in particular?
Everyone.
Everyone.
Words to describe appropriation?
Or alternatives?
It's much more than appropriation. That's a really lame word for what you're doing and what all the other, what Gordon did, I think.
Yeah, well, there's other words that we could use, stealing, plagiarism.
You had your whole land stolen.
Pardon?
You had your whole land
stolen. Yeah, white people in Australia, they got a whole continent for free, basically. It was paid for in Aboriginal blood. I think it's a bit much for them to appropriate, Aboriginal imagery. There's which doesn't exclude room for artists to negotiate, space for each other with like the collaborations that you were talking, that Ian spoke about earlier in his talk. One of the things that I've noticed recently is that appropriation is very much encouraged in Australia at the moment. There's an artist who's now won the Archibald Prize twice. She uses Aboriginal designs, and imagery in her paintings as filler. Just which I think is appalling. And I think the curators and the dealers who show this work, they need to be made answerable to it, because it's morally and ethically wrong. What she's doing in her work, because she doesn't acknowledge that she's influenced by Aboriginal art. So what we have there is a clear case of plagiarism.
And I suppose I'd say that, what artists like Imants Tillers did in their appropriations was, and Gordon after him, was to try and create some sort of space of conversation. I think that idea of conversational and the relational agencies of different voices is it's something of much more interest to contemporary artists than appropriation, per se, which is more, as you said, something from the 80s. And I think Richard especially does that. You often will, like in the Scratch the Aussie, sort of appropriating those Freudian contexts, or in the Boxer one, in a sense, appropriating various cliches around the place, but putting them in some sort of conversation that perhaps creates different relational agencies.
Yeah. Well, what I do is I present Aboriginal people as the landlords, not the tenants.
Yeah.
I symbolise, the landlord.
Yeah.
Pay the rent.
So that's a sort of deliberate inversion.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a deliberate strategy. I use appropriation, a methodology, as a tool.
Yeah, I mean, it's always struck me how many, in Australia anyway, how many urban Indigenous artists have taken on appropriation as a critical strategy.
Yeah, there's a lot.
When I showed Tony Albert, obviously, was another example. There's many. It's almost as if the school of Imants Tillers is urban Indigenous art rather than...
I'm sick of that, being compared to some other fucking white boy.
The unnamed person.
Yes, that's better.
Okay, I'd like to thank our three speakers